There are nights that keep the past alive. September 26, 1983 was one of them. A thin, pale night above Moscow. A night in which the world's most dangerous machines hummed and blinked in the dark. In a concrete bunker outside the city, behind steel doors and thick leaded walls, a limited number of people watched the glow of instruments that were meant to see the first spark of war. The Cold War had taught them to read light and heat as if they were words on a page. Those lights spoke of missiles, of trajectories, of annihilation. They also made mistakes. The early 1980s were a time of sharpened edges. A string of crises had left governments brittle and public confidence low. The rhetoric from across the Iron Curtain hardened into policy. New technologies promised faster detection, quicker response, ever less time to doubt. The Soviet Union had deployed a new satellite system designed for a single, terrible job: to detect missile launches from the United States by the infrared heat of a rocket's exhaust. The system's job was to be infallible, or at least fast enough to leave no time for hesitation. Machines, the logic went, could be more certain than human judgment. On that night, inside the command center known to the Soviets as Serpukhov 15, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat at his console. The room smelled of metal and cold oil, lit by the pale green of cathode ray displays and the tighter, harsher light of control panels. He was a duty officer trained to react, to pass on information immediately and without delay. Protocol was a straight line: detect, verify, report. The report would flow up and down a chain designed to deliver lethal orders in minutes. There was no place in that chain for a single man to decide the fate of millions. And yet, for those minutes, the fate of millions rested, as it always has, on human judgment. Shortly after midnight, the Oko satellites reported a launch. One dot on a screen, then another. Red lights came alive. Alarms began to register. The system said 5 missiles were on their way. In the silence of the room, the sound of mechanical voices and the tapping of keys seemed to slow. Procedures were clear. A detected launch meant Petrov should report to his superiors, who would cross-check radar, and if the attack were confirmed, respond. The logic of deterrence depended on speed and symmetry. Because strategic doctrine treated any attack as potentially existential, the margin for hesitation was poor. Petrov felt that pressure in the set of the room, in the way the lines of the map seemed suddenly sharp and cruel. But the screen told a story the procedures did not account for. The alarm came from a satellite system that measured heat against the cold of space, not from ground-based radar. The ground radar in that sector was silent. The pattern of the launches, a handful of missiles, detected one at a time, did not match the strategic calculus of a first strike. A genuine American first strike, Petrov understood, would likely be massive and unmistakable. It would seek to cripple command and control networks and deliver overwhelming force, not nibble at a single sector in a handful of salvos. He thought about the system itself, new, imperfect, sensitive to conditions in ways not yet fully understood. The decision was not heroic in the clean way stories like to make of heroism. It was connective tissue, a human mind comparing data, logic, history, and risk in a situation the designers had tried to remove human agency from. Petrov judged the alert false. He marked it down in his log as a system malfunction, and critically, did not forward an immediate confirmation up the chain. He chose to wait and to trust a different kind of instrument, a human sense of probability, and the knowledge that technology, for all its precision, could be misled. Those minutes stretched. He watched the displays. He watched the clocks. Around him, protocols hummed like insects, ready to be stirred into action by the slightest official confirmation. By the time ground radar and further checks were completed, the satellites had quieted and the alert had been reassessed. There had been no missiles. The world kept turning. What made that moment extraordinary was not only the stakes, but the fragility of the chain that led to a different outcome. Investigations afterward would show that the ecosystem had been tricked by an alignment of nature and geometry. Sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, viewed from a particular angle by a satellite in an elongated orbit, registered as the hot plume of a missile. A flaw in the algorithm that translated those infrared flashes into a threat had reinforced the illusion. It was an accident of physics and of design. It was also, in the starkest accounting, a near miss on a planetary scale, one small misreading amplified by the mechanisms of deterrence into the possibility of utter catastrophe. Petrov would later say that he had been unsure, that he had felt the weight of the decision. He was not a rebellious saint. He was a career officer who understood the world he served. His choice was practical, rooted in professional judgment and a clear, if informal, understanding that machines can be wrong. He reported what he had seen, the system malfunction, and his superiors, constrained by the same limited evidence, initiated their own verification. The Soviet leadership did not launch a retaliatory strike. In the weeks and months that followed, there was no public award, no parade. For a time, he endured scrutiny for failing to follow the letter of procedure. His career did not soar. Recognition came slowly, from journalists and historians, from the quiet reception of a world later relieved to discover that catastrophe had been averted not by happenstance alone, but by a human decision in a bunker at night. The incident is often told as a story of a single man facing down the machine. That is true in part, and it is a truth worth holding. But it is also a story about systems and their limits, how the very architectures we build to protect us can enshrine new vulnerabilities. It reveals the ways in which culture, technology, and policy intertwine. A system designed to detect the brief, bright heat of a missile exhaust must be interpretable. It must, if possible, be complemented by diverse sources of verification and by procedures that allow for uncertainty. What happened on that night highlighted how much the Cold War's deadlock depended on split-second confirmations, and how perilously close systems could bring humanity to the edge of annihilation through combination of error and design. There is a moral architecture at work here too. Petrov's choice was, at its heart, a refusal to let a machine absolve responsibility. He did not reject technology, he interrogated it. He accepted that devices and codes are tools of decision, not substitutes for judgment. That distinction is especially urgent today, in an era when algorithms make predictions at scales and speeds that outpace human intuition. The technology has changed. Satellite sensors have improved, missile detection networks have multiplied, but the essential problem remains. How do we keep human judgment where it matters? How do we design systems that respect the reality of fallibility and the moral weight of a single input into a nuclear chain? There is also an element of contingency, of chance. The sequence that night could have unfolded differently if timing had been marginally altered, if a higher-ranking commander had been closer, if certain checks were faster. Chance neither diminishes nor diminishes the moral dimension of Petrov's decision. Instead, it underlines how thin the membrane is between managed peace and uncontrolled violence. History is full of such hinge moments, where the weight of the future for a few seconds falls on one person's evaluation of what is real. In the decades since, the world has changed in obvious ways. The Cold War's ideological polarity receded, but nuclear arsenals remain, and new technologies have layered further complexities onto global stability. The 1983 false alarm taught hard lessons: to diversify verification, to improve transparency, and to build more robust fail-safes into systems that watch for fire. It also taught an older lesson, one that is easily obscured by the machinery of modern governance, that courage sometimes looks like caution, and that the refusal to act on fear can be as difficult as the willingness to act in the face of danger. When Stanislav Petrov died in 2017, The headlines called him the man who saved the world. The label is grand and not quite accurate in the simple arithmetic of cause and effect, but it captures something essential. A single human decision altered the course of history that night. The narrative invites us to ask hard questions about responsibility and design, about how we balance certainty and doubt, and about whether the systems we trust to keep us safe are designed with humility. In the end, what matters is not simply the story of one alarm and one man's judgment. It is the fact that the future can hinge on a decision that crosses from automatic procedure into morally weighted choice. The world was not saved by an algorithm. It was not saved by secrecy or doctrine. It was, for a few seconds in a cold bunker, entrusted to a human mind that saw ambiguity where the machine saw threat and chose to let the doubt breathe. That choice asks of us now a similar kind of attention, to design with care, to embed checks that honor complexity, and to remember the stubborn fact that machines do not bear moral responsibility. People do. The cost of forgetting that is one we still cannot afford. So we return to that night and to the man who sat at a console while the world held its breath. We remember the hum of equipment, the green light on the screen, the slowness of minutes that could have been the last. It was a small, human deferral of automation, a refusal to let a machine have the final word. In that refusal, there is a lesson and perhaps a plea. Build systems that preserve the space for conscience, because sometimes it is the smallest gap between signal and action that keeps the world alive.